Canada, long seen as one of the world's leading symbols of openness, growth, and stability, has just recorded something many believed was simply impossible: a population decline. In a country that built its modern identity on immigration, this shift raises an unavoidable question. What is really happening behind this dramatic change? And more importantly, why does a country that has always depended on immigrants now seem, in some ways, to be pushing them away? The latest data shows that in 2025, Canada's population dropped by more than 100,000 people. This is not a minor statistical fluctuation or an isolated event. It is the direct result of policy decisions made over the past few years, particularly regarding immigration. For the first time in decades, population growth didn't just slow, it reversed. To understand how the country got here, we need to go back to the post-pandemic period. At that time, Canada adopted an aggressive population growth strategy, opening its doors widely to international students and temporary foreign workers. The logic seemed straightforward. More people would mean a larger workforce, higher consumption, and ultimately stronger economic growth. And for a while, it worked. The number of temporary residents surged. Universities saw record levels of international enrollment, while businesses increasingly relied on foreign workers to fill positions across multiple sectors. The population was growing rapidly, and at first glance, it looked like a success story. But then came the turning point. This wasn't just growth, it was a policy shock. Under Trudeau, Canada rapidly expanded both permanent and temporary immigration at an unprecedented pace, flooding the system in a short period of time and putting massive pressure on housing infrastructure and overall system capacity. But that rapid growth began to expose a structural problem that could no longer be ignored. The system simply wasn't prepared to absorb that many people in such a short period of time. The most visible impact appeared in the housing market. With the massive influx of new residents, demand for housing skyrocketed. Rent prices surged, making it increasingly difficult for many Canadians, and even for the immigrants themselves, to find affordable places to live. In some cities, the situation became critical. At the same time, urban infrastructure began to show signs of strain. Public services, transportation, healthcare, all were operating under increasing pressure. What had once been seen as growth was now being perceived as a lack of control. And that's when the narrative began to shift. Public perception of immigration, historically positive, started to deteriorate. Polls showed a significant drop in support for high levels of immigration. For many, the issue was no longer abstract. It was felt in everyday life, in the rising cost of living, the housing crisis, and the growing sense that the system was being pushed to its limits. Faced with this situation, the federal government stepped in. Measures were introduced to reduce the number of non-permanent residents in the country. The goal was clear: slow population growth, ease pressure on the housing market, and give infrastructure time to catch up. And indeed, some effects began to appear. Rent increases started to cool. The housing market, while still under pressure, showed signs of stabilization. Unemployment, which could have risen further due to an oversupply of labor, was partially contained. But these changes came at a cost that is now becoming increasingly evident. The reduction in immigration and temporary residents directly led to the population decline. What had once been a driver of growth became a brake. And this raises a fundamental question. How sustainable is this strategy in the long term? The answer is not simple. On one hand, it is clear that the previous pace of growth was unsustainable. The speed at which the population was increasing was not aligned with the country's ability to absorb it. On the other hand, sharply reducing immigration also carries risks, perhaps even deeper ones. That's because Canada depends on immigration in a way that few countries do. Birth rates have been declining for years. Without a steady inflow of newcomers, the population naturally ages and eventually begins to shrink. This has direct economic consequences, reducing the labor force and increasing pressure on systems like pensions and healthcare. Studies illustrate just how critical this dependency is. Without immigration, Canada's population could shrink dramatically over the coming decades. On the other hand, maintaining unchecked rapid growth would also lead to serious sustainability challenges. In other words, the country is caught between two dangerous extremes, and this is where the most important truth behind this invisible crisis begins to emerge. The problem is not immigration itself. The problem is how it has been managed. For years, Canada has swung between aggressive expansion and abrupt restriction. This kind of volatility creates instability, not only economically, but socially as well. Businesses struggle to plan with confidence. The housing market reacts unpredictably, and public trust in policy consistency begins to erode. Instead of a long-term strategy, what has emerged is a series of reactive adjustments, often driven by immediate pressures. And that comes with consequences. One of the most visible is the fragmentation of the immigration system. Over time, multiple programs have been created to address specific labor shortages, many of them focused on short-term needs. While this may solve immediate problems, it can undermine long-term economic productivity and sustainability. Rather than selecting immigrants based on long-term economic contribution, the system has, in many cases, prioritized urgency. Now, with the slowdown, a new challenge is emerging. Sectors that have become dependent on foreign labor are beginning to feel the effects of reduced inflows. Businesses are struggling to fill positions. Regions that once benefited from rapid population growth are starting to see a shift in economic momentum. Even provincial governments, which initially supported stricter measures, are beginning to express concern about labor shortages. This situation reveals a fundamental contradiction. Canada tried to correct an excess by creating a shortage, and that reinforces the idea that the real issue was never immigration itself, but the lack of balance. Looking ahead, it is clear that the country will need to redefine its approach. Immigration will remain essential, not just for economic growth, but for maintaining the country's demographic structure. The question is no longer whether Canada should accept immigrants, but how to do so in a sustainable way. That requires planning. It requires predictability. And above all, it requires a long-term vision. The previous model of rapid expansion showed its limits. The current model of restriction carries its own risks. The challenge now is to find a middle ground, one that aligns economic needs with the country's real capacity, but this transition will not be easy. The decisions made in the coming years will have a direct impact on Canada's future. They will shape not only the size of the population, but also quality of life, economic competitiveness, and social cohesion. And perhaps the biggest lesson in all of this is simple. Public policy, especially in areas as sensitive as immigration, cannot be driven by short-term cycles or reactive decisions. It requires consistency, planning, and responsibility. Canada, long seen as a global model, now faces the challenge of recalibrating its own system. And in doing so, it raises a broader question that goes far beyond its borders. Do quick fixes to complex problems ever truly work, or do they simply create new, even more difficult challenges? That is a question not only for Canada, but right now it is one being answered in real time within the country itself. And the outcome of that answer may define the future of an entire generation.